Muslim stronghold, lost. Catholics victorious. A segment of the Jewish population supporting the Catholics, but not watching their back. And before the year was out, August the 2nd, this victorious Catholic military, headed by Ferdinand and Isabel, turned on the Jewish population that had helped them. And the Inquisition took place August the 2nd in Spain. So before you start dealing with 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue, you got to deal with the Muslim war, you got to deal with the war against the Jews. And then when you see Columbus sailing August the 3rd, you'll see he was on a war footing when he came in contact with the Native Americans. And these innocent people who are part of our people, because many of us have Native American blood, welcomed this humanity into their hearts. And they were devastated because the European had been on a war footing. So that's why I'm saying you need a systems analysis, which he does not want you to have. He's going to talk about 1492, but he's not going to talk about Granada. He's not going to talk about the Inquisition in Spain. And as quiet as it's kept, the Jewish community doesn't talk about it either. Because Spain has made an offer to the Jewish community. We're going to heal our breach. We're going to give you some reparations. You can come back to Spain. Because Spain did not want the Jewish community rallying against their Olympics, rallying against their World's Fair, rallying against the billions of dollars they intend to make on this Columbus celebration. It's about money, y'all. It's about economics. So you got to have an analysis. That's what we're talking about. Now, the analytical framework that we use, and I'm going to quickly run through this, and we'll be back for some smaller workshops at another time for you to deal with this, is around what I call pyramid consciousness, pyramid analysis, because you have to have that. As I said before, we put it in this document, but it was too heavy for them and they took it out. And then what happened with this document was that in April 90, they passed it and accepted it in the Board of Regents in New York. So they put in place a 24-member committee of new people to work on the social studies, putting mainly white folks, a lot of powerful Jewish folks on the committee, including a Nathan Glazer. And they had his partner, Arthur Schlesinger. They had a couple of blacks that appeared to be accommodating, but they miscalculated because these blacks had tapped into Kemet, into Africanism. One of them was from Ethiopia, so you know Ethiopia is a part of the whole Kemetic development, and she's a black woman, so you know she's got that African Holy Ghost. And so they did not realize those few blacks on that committee would be so powerful enough to turn that committee around. And a third grade school teacher, Diane Glover, who's been close to us and close to Adelaide Sanford's, been to Kemet. Diane Glover fought tooth and nail the Schlesingers and the Glazers. And at the end of the process, at the end of a year, they came up with a report called One Nation, Many Cultures, Culturally Interdependent, affirming this report. And the committee voted 22-2 to accept it. Their report came out in July 91. By July 26, 91, the Board of Regents voted to accept it. This meant the victory over the curriculum, which began in 88 and was a 3-year struggle, was now over in 91. We had won the victory. And it was just at that moment that they decided, after the Albany speech, July the 20th, had been shown for 2 weeks, they decided to go back to the drawing board with that anti-Semitic mess and try to create a furor around anti-Semitism to hide the victory that had been won. At no point when we raise the question of enslavement do we focus in on Jews. It's not in our interest. As I said before, because we want to be able to see all of the Europeans involved in enslavement. Because when we raise the question of reparations in 92 and 93, we want to be able to take it to all of them. So whenever we have to raise the question, we always deal with it in its fullness. And we have the transcripts of the various tapes, and we have the transcripts of the classes that we raise these issues. And we always say that the Catholic Church initiated enslavement in the 1400s, giving the Spanish and the Portuguese throne the right to enslave the infidels. And the Portuguese wedded themselves to the Catholic Church, and they initiated the enslavement process, which we call the Atlantic slave trade. And they had a monopoly on it until the Spanish wanted to get in on the deal themselves. particularly after Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And the Spanish throne joined the Portuguese in putting together the foundations of the Atlantic slave trade system. But then the Protestant Reformation, born with Martin Luther, 1517, began to compromise itself. This movement of religious reform compromised itself immediately, because at the birth of the Protestant Reformation, the Spanish asiento was created, which is the contract to take Africans to the Spanish New World. And European nations for the next 300 years fought over the asiento. Who would control the delivering of African enslaved peoples to the Spanish New World? So the Protestant Reformation was compromised on the altar of enslavement immediately. And the Protestant nations that emerged, the Dutch, the English, the Germans, began to join in this struggle for who was going to control the enslavement process. And so when we talk about these things, we have to see it in its fullness. The Dutch, the Swedes, the Germans, the French, the Portuguese, the Italians were all involved. And then they asked for partners. And then they made alliances. And that's where Jewish bankers and merchants came in. And the Dutch wedded themselves with these Jewish bankers. The Germans wedded themselves with these Jewish bankers. And so did the English. And that became the connection around the enslavement process. If you want to understand and appreciate it, then you also have to understand and appreciate sugar. Sugar is the key to understanding how and why there was an involvement of these communities. And sugar explains the alliance between Dutch merchants and bankers and Sephardic Jewish merchants and bankers that came into Holland as a safe haven. And it's this alliance, the safe haven of Dutch and Jews in Holland, that becomes the key to ripping off the system from the Catholics. And from the 1500s, the late 1500s, through the early 1600s, the Dutch and their allies, the Jewish community, ripped the system of slavery off from the Portuguese and neutralized the Spanish. And Amsterdam becomes a leading trading center in the world based upon the enslavement of African peoples. And the Dutch go into Africa and they take Elmina Fort Dungeon, built by the Portuguese. Then they invade Brazil and they take Brazil. And then they invite the Jewish population in Amsterdam to colonize Brazil and help with the sugar industry. But in the 1654s, the Portuguese were able to get a fleet and go back into Brazil and take Brazil again for their own. And then the Jewish community had to migrate out. Some of them went back to Amsterdam, but others went to Suriname, others went to Curacao, some went to Barbados, some went to Jamaica, some went to Haiti, some went to Guadeloupe, some went to Martinique, and some made their way up to New York and eventually Newport, Rhode Island. So in order to understand this linkage, you have to understand sugar technology. And in this chapter on economics, it deals directly with sugar technology, and it proudly states that the Jewish community had a lot to do with the economics of 4 or 5 major commodities. One was sugar, one was coffee, one was tea, and one was cocoa. And they very proudly talk about their accomplishments in this area. But they don't make the complete analysis and link it to enslavement. And that's why you have to be able to have the skills to make the analysis yourself. And so we've come up with a formula called pyramid analysis, which we use over and over again to process data and information. And this will become very important for you in any endeavor that you are involved in. Because what the pyramid does, the equilateral side, or the triangle of an equilateral pyramid, allows you to deal with polarities, duality, allows you to weigh information on both sides of a question, and then break it down, analyze it, and then synthesize it. So one polarity would be what we call the thesis. Another polarity would be the opposite, the antithesis, which could be conflictual or complementary. And then between the two polarities, you weigh the information and data, and you go to the top of the pyramid to synthesize. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. In order to be a true thinker and critically analyze things, you have to become a synthesizer. We can master the European polarity. So if you have mastered both polarities and you interrelate that knowledge and understanding, you can synthesize it and you become a dynamo. This is the multi-billion-dollar African education. This is the million